Hello, my name is Greg Madison, and this is The Living Process. Welcome back. This time, my guest is Lynn Preston, and we're meeting partly because Lynn has just returned from attending a conference in Rome for the Psychoanalytic Self Psychology community. So we talk a little bit about that conference and how Lynn perhaps bridges the gap between the psychoanalytic community and their language and the focusing community and our language. That was quite interesting, the kind of translating that she has to do to belong to both of these different communities. The majority of our discussion really is about groups, and that's what Lynn was presenting at the conference, is how to work with groups in an experiential way. Basically, how to bring what we know from focusing as a personal process and a dyad process into a group process, and how to begin to map the skills and the sensitivities that are required for groups to work in a way that they are open to and welcome the full complexity of each person. One of the reasons I think that Lynn is so interested in this is just because of the polarization that's happening in democracies, and Lynn's concern that we need to be able to find a way to listen to each other, but also to speak to each other, a way that remains respectful and connected to the deeper experiencing process that we know from focusing. So I found it a very interesting and inspiring discussion. And if you are interested in getting involved in the kind of work that Lynn is in and what she's trying to develop, especially this year after the American election, she has said that she welcomes anyone to contact her, and her email address is in the show notes. So here's my conversation with Lynn Preston. Hello, and welcome back to The Living Process. My name's Greg Madison, and this time we have a repeat visit from Lynn Preston. And the occasion of this is especially because Lynn is just back from a conference in Rome. And it's an opportunity for us to hear a little bit about Lynn's other community and also what she was presenting there and what that might mean for us as focusing people and FOTs. Welcome.
Thank you, Greg. I'm very happy to be back with you and to talk with you. I was very eager to share my experience.
Terrific.
As you know, but maybe some other people watching this don't know, I have had one foot in the focusing world and the other foot in the relational psychoanalytic world. And these two communities don't often speak to each other. And so it's a very complicated kind of dance with one foot in each camp. But within me, these two theoretical perspectives, these two communities are united, and they're different languages. And I'm terrible at language. In Italy, I had such a hard time because people don't bend over backwards to speak English to you in Italy. And I'm so bad with languages, but theoretical languages I'm good with. So I like being bilingual there. That's only two, of course, but the focusing language and the psychoanalytic language go very well together for me. But when I'm talking to focusing people, I need to watch that I use focusing language When I'm talking to psychoanalytic people, I have to make sure I'm speaking psychoanalytic language, or people won't understand me. They'll say, "What? What?"
So it might be fun to have a few translations of kind of what would be the equivalent in psychoanalytic language to some of the things that we might experientially understand with different language. But I want to just say back that that certainly is my experience of you, that somehow you have this continuity between these two communities that externally can look quite different and certainly sound different in the ways they describe what happens in a person or what happens in therapy. But do you want to say maybe, first of all, tell us what the conference was? And I would be curious, just generally, kind of what your experience is of being probably one of the very few focusing people at a conference like that. Are people quite open to what you're bringing?
um,
Or do you hide it?
Both.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Uh, it probably is similar for you in the existential therapy world.
Yeah.
Uh, well, let me first say that the conference was a very interesting topic. Kohut um, had talked about how Freud's notion of um, the conflict within people was about guilty man. You know that we have all these impulses toward sex and aggression, and then we have to tame them or do something with them or sublimate them,
Mhm.
and that it's a problem of guilt. And Kohut revolutionized psychoanalysis by saying that his experience with patients was not this terrible struggle of impulses and repression, but it was tragic, man, that we have um, emotional needs that are as powerful as the need for air.
Mhm.
We have the need for empathy and responsiveness. And when those needs aren't met, it leaves this incredible deficit. And so there's a kind of tragic sense of the emptiness that people feel or the narcissistic rage. And I really think that that concept of his is so important and so valuable that when when people seem like they're just bad people, like stay away from them, or the political leaders, that it's like, oh my God, how can they be like that? Um, that they
Not
see,
mentioning any names.
not mentioning any names, right? Yes. The feeling that they're big bullies.
Mhm.
And Kohut, who had lived through the Nazi um, takeover and had to be uh, forcefully removed from Vienna because it was his place. And
Mhm.
he and Jean have a similar, background that way, both living in Vienna and both having to leave, Jean at a much earlier age. But Kohut said that when there's an assault to our sense of self, that there's a fragmentation, and that fragmentation takes the form of what he called endless hatred and lust for revenge. And that's an organismic way of trying to get back our sense of integrity, our
Mhm.
um, sense of power or sense of being. And so people are really falling apart when they look like when they are bullying. He called it a, a a fragmentation byproduct, this narcissistic rage.
Mm.
I find that very, very helpful. So this conference was about tragic man and or tragic person, they're calling it now, and where we are now in our evolution as tragic humans.
Wow, that sounds uh, very creative.
Mm.
Can I just before we go on, I'm just curious. I mean, I love that description of Kohut and sort of his ideas. I don't think maybe you don't often get an opportunity with kind of a humanistic focusing audience to say some of those things.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, and I'm curious what of his theories and ideas, some of the things you've just said, have you found really important and interesting? What is it he brings to you that feels so valuable?
Well, this idea of empathy as oxygen
Hmm.
and the ways that we will bend ourselves into pretzels, we'll do anything to um to have that empathy that we need, that sense of the gleam in the parent's eye.
Hmm.
Um
Hmm.
and after Kohut sort of died young, and people uh, have taken his work a lot further. And I think we're just beginning to do that with Jean's work.
Hmm.
We're beginning um, to carry it further in different directions.
Yeah.
Um, but the idea of Bernie Branchef that I've shared with you before, of pathological structures of accommodation,
Yeah.
of being from before birth even, um, having this sense of what you can think, what you can feel, and what's dangerous to think, or what will hurt the mother or the family. Um, and not even it being conscious, um, but it being implicit uh, and so many of the people that we work with don't have a sense of themselves at all, what they think, what they like,
Hmm.
what what they don't like, what they want. And it's so primal. And I think that understanding helps me. It's like, oh, we have to start from the beginning.
Hmm.
You know, you like milk in your coffee,
Yeah. As I hear that, I can begin to sense some of how that can also be seen through Jean's language.
Yes,
So language that sounds so different, actually, it's pretty easy to begin to see how it's pointing in the same direction in some way.
exactly. Yes. Would you say it in Jean's language?
Well, one of the things that I'm thinking is the pathological structures of accommodation. Um, it's where the person isn't able to carry forward themselves the way they're implied.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
They hit something in the environment that says no, or they at least interpret the environment as saying no to what would be right for them. And kind of all of the elaborations that allows for the person, but also potential stoppages and perhaps rage and all sorts of other things. All of the attempts to get the body back somehow. And the other thing you were talking about was the exactly that, the rage that is, and this is how I would say it in slightly different language, the rage that is an attempt to redeem one's wholeness or to redeem one's own carrying forward.
Mhm.
And that's something I think we know in a way in focusing, that even in something that feels bad or maybe behavior that's destructive, something positive is trying to happen.
Mm. Yes, yes, yes.
So I'm curious, the other part of my sort of general question before we get to the more specific things that you were playing with in Rome. Um, the other, the general question is just, so how is it received in the self-psychology community if you talk about Jean's work or focusing or approach some of their concerns from a focusing perspective? I would think you would do that very carefully so you're not kind of mixing up the language and getting immediate resistance. But is there an openness to yeah, you
Oh,
have,
yes.
yeah.
I had written a paper years ago on the edge of awareness. I actually, consulted with Gene about it. He was
Hmm.
very interested in my writing it. And usually you have to jump through a lot of hoops to get things published in their journal. This that was snatched up immediately, and people are still using it in their classes and asking me about it. There were several people that came and said that they had uh, read my paper and wanted to cite me in this and this way. Um, so it was very well received. I think that if I'm speaking and in focusing language, people won't recognize that as their community.
Mhm.
In For example, I mean the tone and the feeling is very different. They're much more academic. So I couldn't say make a friendly space, say hello to that
Yeah.
inside yourself. Um, couldn't say that there.
Mhm.
Um, but I want to go back to what you asked me before, which was how these languages go together.
Yeah.
Um, I talked to Bill Coburn, who wrote the article Complexity Theory Made Simple. I think I might have shared that with you.
Mhm.
And I had shared that with Gene, and I was so impressed when I shared that article with him because it was very, very new to me. And he just read it and while I was sitting there, and he underlined certain things. He said, "Oh yeah, he liked it. I mean, he didn't do anything with it, but
Mhm.
he digested it but at any rate, that idea of uh, in psychoanalysis of psychoanalytic complexity theory. It's not all the string theory and all of that, but this idea of systems within systems within systems, and that the person is a system, and then the group and the society and the culture and the zeitgeist, that there are all of these systems,
Mhm.
and that a complex system is self-generating. It's it has a momentum of
Yeah.
its own. And the psychoanalysts would talk about a developmental thrust.
Mhm.
Uh, that's not in complexity theory, but that's a deeply, which is so similar to our carrying forward energy.
Mhm.
And this idea that the system wants to, if you can anthropomorphize it, the system, the society, the species, our species wants to uh, be self-regulating
Yeah.
and self-regulating, like the tipping point, not being too chaotic so it flies apart and not being um, too rigid. So that place in therapy and in groups where you want enough spontaneity and freedom, and
Hmm.
you want enough order so that people feel safe and
Yeah.
contained. Um, and I find that language fits with each other very, very well. The focusing language of carrying forward and it having its own, even the part of the self having its own um, momentum to carry forward.
So let me say that back to you in a different way, and just to see if it still captures what you're saying. That a living system,
Mhm.
in order to maintain itself in some equilibrium or balance, or it's in its right form, if you want to say it that way, it it needs to continue to grow in some way. A living system, part of its rightness is its continued movement and growth or evolution, and that growth, if you call it that, is actually self-propelled. It's something that comes from the system itself.
Mm.
It has to continue to develop itself in order to maintain its own balance.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I would say it even more strongly
Okay.
that it dies without
Yeah,
having
yeah, exactly.
enough spontaneity or without having enough order. And these are systems like galaxies and things like that, or
Yeah,
microorganisms, but also human
yeah,
systems, of
yeah,
course.
yeah.
And
Can I just say that back? That's the important thing I was trying to capture, but now you've said it more clearly. That a living system, its greatest stability is not if it's stable and stuck and steadfast and static.
right,
You might think that that is its utmost stability, but in fact, for a living system, that's unstable and threatens its very survival.
yes.
And I'm immediately curious, and maybe this is a bit of a bridge to what you actually presented. I'm immediately curious about whether that's not only true of a living system like a person or an animal or something, but if it's also true of a living group or a living organization.
Yes, yes. And of course that's where we're going in this idea of the us, right? That the us has a life of its own.
Yeah.
Um, but I wanted to just catch one little thread there that the the notion of perturbation in from complexity theory is a very important notion. That when the system is stuck or chaotic, that there's some kind of disruption, and the disruption is um, can be a way back to finding the way forward. And of course, we know that in focusing, and we know that as therapists, that if a therapy relationship gets too routine and
Hmm.
predictable, um, there'll be something, right, that comes up that is a big thing that we have to navigate together, and that will bring us back to to each other, to the system that we are, to awareness,
To growing together.
to growing together. Yes, and that's so true in groups.
Hmm.
Um, I'm doing a class on working with groups and communities, and part of the class is being a group. And now in the class we have all of the things, all of the human things are now right there. The longing to belong, the feeling of being left out, the feeling of needing a voice, the feeling of somebody doesn't like you, the feeling um of uh there's us and then there are those people, all of the things. Um and then we have all the things. And then if we see that as a system rather than, oh, this person is making trouble, or this person, you know, is too shy, or in therapy, this person can't focus, or oh, this group, they can't find the deeper level or something like that, which doesn't get us anywhere. But if we look at the system and we say, oh, it went from too polite to a little too chaotic, and and now people are frustrated, and how can we bring it back to this place where we're really listening? And that's what I was talking about in the conference.
I'm immediately curious about how you would do that in a focusing oriented way.
um well, in the class next time,
Mm.
um we'll we'll talk about, our group, our us,
Yeah.
and what people feel about it, and we'll center into ourselves, and um, and we'll together find the place of seeing what we as a group are trying to get at, trying to make room for, and um, each person is standing up for something. Like there'll be somebody that's standing up for theory, or um, and somebody that's no, that's too abstract. Standing up for experience, the people who are standing up for the social political concerns, and the people who are standing up for the personal life concern. There that is our natural process. Um, And I think that gives me a lot of courage, because I say, well, this is our natural process, but we can also find a way of acknowledging all of the things. I see your doggy. All of the things that are being stood up for. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. It's not like
Yeah.
this, we have this, or we have this.
I guess what I'm imagining, because it's you, that it may include, uh, you didn't really make this explicit in the way you described it, but I'm reading into it, that it may include um, members of the group quietly sensing inside of themselves, and that kind of experiential depth, bringing that into the kinds of explorations and questions that you're talking about.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So that's what you're presenting in Rome?
Well, I was presenting a workshop uh, taken from Kohut's a quote from Kohut that says
Hmm.
that our species is on the edge of destroying ourselves, because we can't make room for others, and that psychoanalysis needs to, in order to be good for anything, it needs to make an impact on the world. So I took that quote and talked about revolutionary listening, which is very much your thing,
Hmm.
revolutionary listening and empathic responsiveness in a global frame. And that would be the psychoanalytic way of um, saying our listening approach. The psychoanalysts are very interested in the frame, And as an artist, I love that concept. If something looks very different in one frame than another frame,
Mhm.
and a global frame sort of expresses this passion that I have, that what we know as therapists, what we know as focusing people, what we know as psychoanalytic people, what we know just from a lifetime of working with people, has to be impacting our social political sphere, or else, it seems so silly somehow that we know these things, and people have to pay a lot of money to have 45 minutes with us, and they'll have an experience of that, a few people, and here's this world that's
Yeah.
sort of on the brink of missing that tipping point.
So I'm curious about your plan to bring revolutionary listening to the masses.
Well, I'll tell you my secret.
Okay. We'll keep it between us.
Keep it between us. Don't tell anybody. But my secret grandiose plan is that, as consciousness raising groups was so much part of the social change in the 70s, that we would have groups now that um, would have that function of allowing people to talk to each other across difference. And that's my way of saying the kind of community empowerment groups. And of course, they can be lots of other models too, but the model that I'm developing is is a model of uh, the the group not being ordered by having rules and expectations from the leaders, and then the people are behaving well or not behaving well, but the self-generating kind of uh, movement that is organically, and that's so much focusing. It's uh, to really reject the group think and the sense of imposing
Mhm.
standards or views, any kind of views on the people in the group, but allowing all of the voices. And this is so much what you're doing, Greg. It so fits this embodied democracy where all of the voices, including the ones that we hate, are all needed. We need to hear from everybody,
Mhm.
even if what they say is something we don't like. We need to hear from them,
Mhm.
and we need to give space for that to evolve into something that we can really understand.
Yes. I guess as I hear that, I'm thinking the thing that I would add to it from my own perspective and sort of embodied or experiential democracy, whatever you want to call it, is not only each person needs to be heard from, but
Yes.
each part of each person.
Right.
Because I have this guess, which may not always be true, of course, but I have this guess that within each of us, there's a lot of diversity. And the the part of me that has the voice may be strongly expressing one point of view, but expressing it so strongly partly because it's actively talking over some other part of me that has a slightly more nuanced point of view, at least.
Yes.
And I guess my question is whether there might be a way in a group not only to welcome the individuals in the group so that it becomes an organic system, but to welcome each person, encourage each person to welcome within themselves the diversity that's already there. So it's like a group that's a group of groups.
Yes, exactly.
Mhm.
Yes, yes, I'm very with you there.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, there has to be an ethos of what we would call the focusing attitude, what the analysts would call an empathic milieu,
Mhm.
where those different parts of the self, different voices within people are welcomed.
Yeah.
One of the that yes, that in order for that part of me that might be rejected to even come into formulation,
Mhm.
there has to be enough room and
Mhm.
understanding for me to voice it.
Yeah.
I the way that I did the workshop was to talk a little bit about these groups, but then to show some clips of my community empowerment uh,
Mm.
project. And that was so powerful. And
Mhm.
I'm very excited about that. Um, Probably people watching us might know that you and I are both on this committee to for the FOT channel, to bring the livingness of a video into which the psychoanalysts haven't done that. There aren't
Oh.
they don't use video so much. So it's sort of new there. So they were they they loved that to
Mhm.
be actually brought into the group process. So I showed one process where we were talking about climate crisis, climate rage, and climate grief, and people were talking about how they didn't talk about that much because it would bring up their judgmentalness and it would make trouble and people wouldn't want to hear it and they felt guilty about not talking about it um and then a couple of people in the group said that they don't care about the climate. They could care less because they don't have children, they don't have grandchildren. This one person said don't have grandchildren and they don't feel part of the world. And so, who cares that nobody cares what they think anyway. And this other person also who said, nobody listens to me, so I don't I don't have a vote in this, what we do about the climate, so forget it. And what was really interesting there, or or pivotal there, was that that could be received in the
Mhm.
group. People weren't going to say, you asshole, you're, you know. um, and it was then taken to another step, and one young woman, Abby, who I think
Mhm.
uh, talked so beautifully about how alienation is one of the biggest problems uh, in climate crisis because people don't feel that they can make an impact. And
Mhm.
it's very beautiful, and it is up the on our on our website. Um, but that was taking these parts of these people, which I don't think the people who said that, all of them thinks that, but they were
Mhm.
expressing this part of themselves
Yeah.
and and seeing what that means in terms of this next level of social political um, belonging, and seeing this problem of alienation in a big way.
So I'm curious if you see that problem of alienation in a big way, how do you go further to address that? These revolutionary listening groups or community empowerment groups, I'm imagining I'm trying to imagine how could they have an impact? How could that be a model for allowing the larger system to find its balance in growth again?
Well, I think that it has to be in these little ways,
Hmm.
um, just as consciousness raising groups. I mean, how could they impact the society? These little groups of women just sitting around talking about their problems. And then, for example, a little group of women talking about how they feel so bad about their breasts. Somebody has breasts that are too big, somebody has breasts that are too small, too saggy, and then everybody says their thing. And then we say, well, what is the culture here that is impacting on us?
Hmm.
There's suddenly a feeling of, well, it's not just my breasts. It's
Hmm.
it's something in the society that I don't necessarily agree with.
Hmm.
And I think that these little groups, and I think that it's happening in certain ways. I think groups are the way to go now. Um, but I think that the little groups have their own carrying forward, where at the end of that group, there's a feeling of, oh, I understand this better, or I'm
Hmm.
settled in it, or something that then um, ripples out. But it isn't, if you try to make it an activist group, I think that it's a big problem, because then everybody has to agree about what kind of action. And I think one of the principles that's really important to me in these community empowerment groups is that we're not looking for everybody to agree. We're
Yeah.
not looking um, to have to take action together. Everybody might take their own action, and a few people might take action together, and maybe even, a lot of people, but not everybody.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I like the sound of that. And having worked a little bit with activist groups, it has a very different feel to what you're describing in these groups. I think there's something about the demand to be activist that somehow narrows the scope for welcoming and reflection and processing.
Yeah, yeah.
Interesting. So I'm still wondering a little bit about, it sounds like your sense is that if groups like this were to spring up around the world in different places, they would have a kind of a ripple out effect through the individuals of the group, or sometimes maybe two or three people working together, that there would be some kind of an impact that slowly gains enough momentum that the larger system then um, is infected. You might say. I was looking for a much nicer word, but the larger group is inspired.
Hmm. Yeah, 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 absolutely. Well, I think that we have that in focusing,
Hmm.
that um, little groups and partnerships all
Yeah.
over the world make a big impact. Not big enough for us. I mean, it feels like there's a lot more, but it feels to me um, that the idea of the going inside has really impacted our society, and people know about that. They know about what I would call, for the analysts, I would talk about embodied um, reflection, or embodied introspection, or
Hmm.
something like that,
Hmm.
um, which I think actually says it better than the word focusing.
Hmm.
says it. But we know that in many, many, many societies, the power of that. But the other side of what Jean was teaching, we don't have yet. The side of relating. So we've learned something about revolutionary listening, but we haven't really learned something about revolutionary speaking.
Mm.
And we the people that I work with love Jean's paper on fitting in, pouring out, and relating. And people are very encouraged by this is an evolutionary step of relating, where you're speaking to the other person, not just speaking out
Hmm.
or speaking at,
Hmm.
where you're speaking from
Hmm.
the experience that's alive in you,
Hmm.
and that you're speaking for something that you really believe,
Hmm.
and you're speaking with people. Um, and that kind of speaking, I think, goes with the listening for what's deeply felt in the other person, listening for
Yeah.
what's trying to emerge, listening for, you know, we know more about the listening for than we do the speaking. And we know much more about the the going inside part of finding the world within us, which it's all there, the microcosm of us, than we do about really relating to the world. And that, so I think that your work and my work is an attempt to bring it into the present moment more, where
Mhm.
relating is so critical.
As I hear you say that, I'm just thinking how, uh, tempted to say how sophisticated this kind of relating and speaking actually is.
Mm,
That's even in the focusing world, people that have been focusing for decades, it's not automatically there.
right. Oh, yes, that's right.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering how can that be? I don't know if you teach it or if you set up the opportunity for it to be practiced repeatedly. What's your thinking on how people can actually get this in the way that you're describing it so that there is actual speaking and listening, so that the relating is received and responded to so that there's further relating?
Oh, yeah, such a good question. Can I go back a second to
Yeah.
the psychoanalytic world and the
Mhm.
focusing?
Yeah, good.
I think the psychoanalytic world, the relational psychoanalysis, has many of the elements that we have in focusing:
Hmm.
an understanding of the implicit, an understanding of development and what we would call carrying forward, an understanding of the depth of the individual, um, and the sacredness of that. And um, what it doesn't have is a practice.
Mm.
So people are in psychoanalysis, but that's a private, personal thing. And focusing has this practice that we know about. And so it feels to me that the practice of focusing needs to be expanded to practices of relating, where um, where we're maybe taught in a sense, or we're teaching each other as in focusing, the ideas of speaking from and speaking to. Um, but then it's lived out, it's lived forward, so that people aren't only taking turns. Taking turns is such an interesting thing. The groups always want the structure of taking turns so they know when is their turn.
Hmm.
And and I think in conflict or something like that, we need to have structures of taking turns. The consciousness raising group used that too. But the real world is not going to be taking
Yeah.
turns. And we have to know how to speak up
Hmm.
uh, when there's a lot going on and speak for and so that practice is it needs to be a practice. It isn't
Yeah.
something that we're just going to know from
Yeah.
knowing this thing.
Yeah, I agree. And as I listen to you, I find myself thinking again that I'm interested in it expanding out into the world. And one of the ways that I would be curious to try would be teaching listening. Because my guess is that if we could teach listening, kind of experiential listening as we know it, and focusing, it actually requires taking a turn. It requires tuning into oneself. It requires learning how to take in the other so that you can reflect back the essence of what they're trying to say to you and to let go of your own agenda, your own point of view, at least for those 5 minutes or something. It teaches so much about focusing and about relating through just teaching listening. And what I'm thinking, rightly or wrongly, is it's maybe, I don't know about this actually, but maybe it's less, um, almost less confrontational or feels less, um, kind of less of a big deal to learn listening rather than to try to teach people focusing. Trying to teach people focusing, it can feel a little bit like I'm setting myself up to learn this technique that this community already knows, and they're going to teach me how to be a little bit more like them or something. Whereas
Yeah.
listening sounds a little bit more like, well, listening is something that we all do in some way anyway. So we're just talking about refining it so that it's much more effective, so that you and the other person feel heard. It sounds like there's no, you can't really say that you're trying to get people into a cult or anything if you're just teaching listening. But I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, I totally agree, but I would go a step further and say that teaching listening, which is what Jean did, that was very powerful, still ends up with the dyad.
Yes,
And
that's right.
uh, and I think, you know, uh, my passion is to expand that dyad
Yeah.
and to teach speaking as well as listening. So what I would imagine when you said you want to take it into the world, and
Mm.
I had this flash of inspiration when you said that, and I thought what I'd like to do is do a community empowerment group uh, of a certain number of sessions, and then ask each person to have a group of their own, of just their friends, maybe,
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
friends or something,
Hmm.
and to do that number of sessions um, instead of paying for the
Hmm.
instead
Hmm.
of paying for the course. And Jean did that. Jean uh, had people take on patients as uh, without fee in exchange for the training. But I thought there would be a wonderful way of asking each person just to gather some friends together.
Yeah.
And for 6 sessions, practice
Mhm.
listening and speaking.
Yeah, I like that. Um, my imagining is to get groups of people. It could be, you know, in the UK, you could go to the local Labour Party group and the local Conservative Party group and say that you're offering this for free. And it might be a useful skill. You don't have to do anything with it if you don't want to, but let's learn it together. And
Yeah,
you have a church hall or someplace and you get like 50
yeah,
people teaching them all of this. And sometimes you're paired up with somebody that's
yeah,
very
yeah,
different from
yeah.
you.
Mm-hmm.
And to talk about, when is it easier to listen? When is it more difficult to listen? What sort of things do you find it hard to listen to?
Yes,
And how to keep separate the idea of listening and agreeing or disagreeing. Because I think often
yes,
we're
exactly.
worried if we listen to somebody, we're tacitly agreeing with them.
Right. That's right.
And the next step for me would be if it was possible to teach. I remember in America, there's the Peace Corps, it'd be a kind of like a listening corps that could then go out on the streets and listen to anyone.
Mm.
But the thing that feels important to me is that these would be ordinary people that are simply interested enough to learn it and then found it valuable enough that they want to give it to someone else in terms of listening to other people. And it's not therapists or professionals of some kind, it's the general population. So you're kind of beginning to embed listening as a citizenship skill
Yes, yes,
rather
yes,
than a professional skill.
yes. That's beautiful. I love what you're saying there, that it's a citizenship skill, not a professional
Yeah.
skill.
But I want to go back to what you were saying because I think that's very important. You're right. The way that I'm talking about it is still the dyad. And the next evolution of it is the group where listening and speaking are required, not just listening. And in our focusing training in London, we have what we call focusing conversations, and we have a particular topic. And we have groups of, five, maybe 5 to 10 people. These are people that have had a year of learning focusing. And how difficult it is, even in a group like that, to remain connected with your oneself and speak or listen in a kind of a group setting. It is so easy to lose oneself. And I'm wondering, how would you teach that? It's almost like a whole new sophistication level of interacting when you move from the dyad to the group.
Mm, yes.
Have you found ways of working?
Yes, well,
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to. It's very challenging, and I think that I'm enjoying the challenge of it. I like a complicated puzzle to figure out. Um, I think that it entails listening to the group as well as listening to the individual.
Yes.
And that is a whole other level of sophistication.
Hmm.
Um, and I think it's a way of listening to each person as themselves, and there's a world within them, but also listening to them as an ingredient of the whole,
Yeah.
that the group is struggling. For example, my class is struggling to become an us,
Hmm.
that they feel each person feels they could be themselves and belong. And that's, a kind of universal struggle.
Yeah.
And if we can see it as uh, the, the group as an organism that's struggling find its legs.
Hmm.
Uh, and each person is one of the legs of this of this organism, trying to uphold something that the whole thing needs.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think it's very difficult to teach that. But the thing about it that is fascinating to me is that groups have uh, have a, what would you call, a magnetism. They have a force. They have, people want to belong. I mean,
Hmm.
this is these classes that I'm teaching. This is a class that meets every other week, for 6 weeks. Who cares whether I belong or I don't belong? You care.
Hmm.
You want to be heard.
Hmm.
Why do you care? It's like there's something in a group that generates that life force that wants a voice and wants a place and wants to be known. And you have that momentum
Hmm.
there of caring.
Well, that's interesting because I think we're implicitly talking about the us and the individual. That the kind of group you're talking about is a creation of a generative us in some way, but a creation of the us that doesn't lose the person.
Right, exactly.
That somehow the person is more alive, more present, not less.
Yes,
And
exactly.
yeah, that is the trick because groups can easily slide into something that makes the person less rather than more.
Yes. That's why Gene
Yeah,
stayed away from.
yeah,
He would always make his group into dyadic interactions. He would
yes,
say, "Don't talk to them, talk to me."
yeah,
You
yes,
know? And
yeah.
so, yes, but it's the same with crossing anything. Gene was so careful or uh, diligent about saying that when you're crossing two theories or you're crossing two cultures or two people, that
Mhm.
it has to be more, not less. It can't be watered down um, to the least common denominator.
The problem with the group is if there's 10 people and I'm one in the group, it can feel like nine against one. It's not it rather than a crossing, it can feel like colonization.
And what that's the challenge, right?
Yes.
That you're working with.
Yeah.
I mean, the challenges of focusing, we know those challenges. The critic coming in, the um, dissociation, all of the challenges of focusing
Hmm.
are on our map. We know them,
Hmm.
but the challenges of um, group interaction, we haven't put on a map yet.
No, exactly. Exactly, because the way that I'm imagining it is I know that Gene said the group is more than the individual and the individual is more than the group. I would say I'm holding that lightly. We'd have to see if that's true. It intuitively makes sense to me, but I don't want to just swallow that. But I'm thinking that an aspect of this is how to be in a group together, how to be in relationship in a way that each person's integrity is welcomed, where it's not like the group is a threat to one's integrity. Instead, the group forms the kind of environment that I know that you're working towards, the kind of environment that's like the focusing attitude.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that is such a kind of a it is a real process of finessing in each moment, I'm thinking.
Yes, and it is a matter of practice.
Hmm. Hmm.
In one of my groups a few years ago, um, when Trump was president, there was one person in the group who was a Trump supporter, and we were talking about uh, well, I should say the first time that this came up, that was chaos. So then we said, no, we're just going to reflect, right? We're not going to have chaos. Um, we're going to really reflect and deepen our conversation. So I wouldn't let anybody. That was the autocrat. Um, but that we got to a better, a listening place. That's something that you can't really teach or structure. Well, I did structure it by just allowing reflection, but it's a living process.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm curious about it. I remember being in a focusing conference and being in a group where someone was reflecting on what was happening in the group and said, uh, maybe there's some unexpressed anger in the group. And then the next person that spoke picked it up as the unexpressed anger in the group. It now had just within a few minutes, it had become a fact. And so I had to speak up and say, I'm not actually feeling angry. Like, don't put that on me.
Mm-hmm.
It's like things can become so concretized
Mm-hmm.
and slip from metaphor or possibility into actuality or fact,
Absolutely. Yes.
and then it becomes oppressive.
Yes, exactly. And that's what has to be on the map, right?
Yeah,
That to
exactly.
say,
Yeah,
can you find that feeling of the anger, unexpressed anger?
that's really interesting to me because now I'm really realizing what you mean by map. Because in FOT or in focusing partnership or listening, we have a map of all the different kinds of
Yeah,
helpful responses. If this happens, it may be helpful to suggest that,
right.
blah, blah, blah.
Exactly.
So to have a group map that has all of those resources laid out there as possibilities,
Yes.
yeah, that would be very helpful.
Yeah. And it would be very alive for the group to make it. You
Hmm.
know,
Hmm.
what is our map? What are our resources? What can we do?
Yeah, that's a really good idea.
Oh, I love it that you think it's a good idea.
Yeah, no, that sounds really because that would be fun to experiment with and to teach and to
Yes,
add
yes,
to. And
yes,
yeah.
yes,
Hmm.
yes, yes,
It's a next step in the focusing world.
yes, yes, that's absolutely
Yeah.
true.
And in the world, maybe.
Yes. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could contribute something to the world that needs it
Yeah.
so much?
Anything else that you want to add before we end it for today?
Well, this could have been back when I was talking about my presentation in Rome,
Hmm.
but I'll put it in here. I
Yeah.
had showed the one clip of the uh, people making room for each other in terms of climate crisis. And one of the people in the workshop said she's a climate activist. She said, but but what I'm terrified of is conflict, and you're not really showing us how the group can handle conflict. So then I showed another clip where we were talking about racism, and it was a year later, so this group had been together and had been practicing, and it was wonderful how the group managed the conversation so that they could really hear what was being said. And in the first clip, um, in the first clip, people were making room for each other, but each saying their own thing
Mhm.
and allowing the other to say their own thing. In the second clip, the group was working as a team to allow this issue to be spoken truthfully and genuinely, and for people to be able to express their feelings about it.
Interesting.
So I guess I wanted to say that because there is something about a group that is the collaboration,
Mhm.
the improvisation. And that's true also for the dyad. I mean, I've taught that for years, the improvisational nature of psychotherapy and the dyad working together as a team.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess, I mean, that sounds really wonderful and interesting. I immediately think that requires a longer term commitment in the group.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. Well, it would be, yeah. Can people contact you if they're inspired to get
Oh, of
involved?
course.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. This is the year to bring this into the world. But I like your name for it much better than my name.
What was my name?
Your embodied democracy
All right.
is a
Okay.
much better name for this than community empowerment. But I feel stuck with community empowerment because it was all I could think of at the moment. But I just want to acknowledge that I think your name for this territory
Mhm.
is a wonderful name because it has within it so much more
Mhm. Well,
expressive.
somehow I think the two names together sort of start to um, show how big the map is.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so
Okay.
let's end on that note. And of course, people can always contact me.
Okay, perfect. I'll put your details. Thank you very much, and I'm really glad we had a chance to talk.
Me too.
Okay.